Welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week, we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration, and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Hello, my name is Ruth Lue-Quee, your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I'm an educational consultant, also known as My Mummy Teacher, founder of NMT Play, and I'm passionate about inclusion and play. Throughout this series, we'll be discussing a range of topics aimed at supporting SEN in the early years, inspiring you with guidance and resources to enhance your practice. I'm delighted to introduce Professor David Daley as today's guest. Welcome to the podcast, David. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Ruth, and thank you for the invitation to join you.
Yeah, it's brilliant to have you here. Before we get started, could you just give a little quick introduction about yourself for our listeners?
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Professor David Daley. I am Professor of Psychological Intervention and Knowledge Exchange and also Head of Applied Psychological Practice at Nottingham Trent University. I am a child psychologist by training, and I have specialised in the past on the developmental psychology of the preschool period. So actually focusing mostly on what happens to children and at home before they get to you in the early years environment.
This fascinates me so much, and I'm really looking forward to all of the value that you're going to be able to provide to us today. In our first episode, we're going to be having a look at understanding behaviour in SEN settings. So we're going to look at the roles of pupil behaviour. We're going to think about the whys and the drivers behind certain behaviours, what behaviours look like, and what practitioners and teachers can do to support pupils effectively. You know, there's so much that essentially goes on underneath the behaviour that we're actually seeing with our children within the setting. So when we talk about behaviour communication, what do we actually mean?
So when we talk about behaviour communication, we really are talking about why is the child behaving in the way that they do, and what is it that they are trying to tell you as a practitioner by their behaviour? And of course, confusingly, they may be sending very mixed signals. So a child may be actually engaging in very externalizing behaviour. They may be very non-compliant. They may be refusing to do things. And so that's the behaviours that you see, and the behaviours that as an early years practitioner, of course, you struggle with. The communication bit may come from actually that what the child is actually saying is that I'm struggling, I need help. So we need to remember as professionals that, for instance, when a child has a tantrum, which happens a lot in early years provision, what they're actually saying is, I'm out of control. And while the behavior might look as if it's very challenging, and of course it breaks all of the class and school rules, what the child is actually saying is, help, I'm out of control. And I need somebody to step in and help me gain control. I need to borrow an adult's brain because my little early years brain isn't able to cope with or regulate whatever it is that I am feeling and experiencing. And so it's important for practitioners to think about the function of the child's behavior and to think about what the child is actually communicating to them as practitioners, so that guides their response. Because if you are a 5-year-old in total meltdown because you're feeling scared and anxious, then an early years practitioner who might apply a classroom or school rule in a really overt way, so you've engaged in a transgression, so I am now going to give you the appropriate sanction. They quite often they're not providing what it is that the child actually needs. The child might actually need reassurance, they might need a hug, they might just need some time on their own to be able to calm down and gain control. And so the use of a sanction or the use of an inappropriate sanction can quite often add, fuel to a flame, when in fact what we're trying to do is put the fire out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really key what you've said there. There's an unmet need, isn't there, essentially, these feelings for our toddlers or for our 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds even, they're so big. They're so new quite often. They can feel quite scary. They just don't understand. And what you said there about they need to borrow us to be that secure base to support them through how they're feeling is so, so key. And we need to consider that in being able to support them best. It's thinking, okay, this is how the child's displaying. What is the need that they need right now that I can do to put in place to support them? And one of the things that I think sometimes can be overlooked that we perhaps may not think about is sensory sensitivities. So how could the sensory, perhaps the environment or a particular sensitivity that a child's got, how could that be a trigger for a child with SEN?
So I think, I mean, the environment plays an enormous role in supporting the expression of all sorts of behaviour problems. But what's really important for early years practitioners to understand is that the environment will influence the expression of behaviour in different ways for different children. So it will be different environmental triggers. So early years practitioners are now much more aware of the heterogeneity of difficulties that children in their care may arrive in the early years environment with. So you may have children who may have high levels of ADHD type problems. They won't have a diagnosis yet because of their age, but a lot of those children will struggle with waiting. And so some of the triggers, the environmental triggers for their behaviour will be around waiting. So it may be about waiting to go out into the playground because there are 28 or 30 children who need help putting their coats on. It may be about waiting their turn to go on one of the class iPads or something else, but it will be around waiting. Lots of other children won't have any problem with waiting, but children who might be more higher up the autistic spectrum, so with higher levels of autistic-like traits, will have more core sensory needs. So they may be much more vulnerable to noise. So when the ADHD child is having a tantrum because he's got frustrated waiting and he's not been able to regulate, the noise from that child may actually trigger the child who has higher levels of autistic traits. But of course, sensory needs go so much beyond that. It could be something as simple as the lighting in the classroom. There was a huge expansion in our schools in the 1960s, and all of those wonderful 1960s schools come with wonderful 1960s lighting. So it's really, really harsh lighting in these classrooms. It also comes with 1960s heating. So these classrooms are really hot and really bright. And for lots of children, that can be an enormous trigger. And it can be triggers that they may struggle to manage. Likewise, lots of children definitely who have higher levels of autistic traits, but it is also possible to have high levels of sensory needs and not be particularly high in autistic traits. But for children with sensory needs, some of it may be touch. And in the early years, there's a huge emphasis on, sitting around on the floor, having story time and doing group activities sat on the floor. It's really worth, as a early years practitioner, looking at the floor of your classroom. Most modern early years areas have horrible industrial carpet that we expect children to sit on. And if you touch it, it's really, really unpleasant. And for most of it, it's just unpleasant. But for children with high levels of sensory needs, sitting on that grey industrial nylon carpet that's been selected because it's never going to wear out, can be really, really unpleasant, and it can be triggering. And so what may look like in the earlier practitioners planning a wonderful activity, a story or a show and tell sat on the carpet, really ticking all of the boxes, an excellent lesson for most of the children, can actually be torture for children with high levels of sensory needs. And it may be that they need to have something to sit on, a cushion, something with that's much more sensory, a kind of a really fluffy or silky cushion for them to sit on, just because they can't tolerate that cheap industrial flooring, essentially.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like you've just brought it all back to me now. I can remember even myself having to sit on that as a child. Like, it's really rough, isn't it? Or we make children sit on, if they're in the school hall. Like for some children, they just don't feel right in their body. And when they don't feel right, it doesn't matter what's going on around us. It doesn't matter if we're singing the most beautiful song or we've got our puppet and we're trying to get them to join in and engage. If they don't feel right, like they're not going to learn and their behaviour may be triggered. And that's one of the things that can be quite difficult is identifying what the trigger was. So we might see the behaviour, but we might be thinking, well, what is it that's caused this behaviour? Is there anything that practitioners can do to support them to identify triggers?
They can, of course, identify triggers. So the key is to be curious. Be curious about why a child may be really struggling. So a child who really likes an activity, when they're stood up, why are they really struggling with it when they're sat down on the carpet? Or a child who, is really well behaved on a Monday afternoon, why do they really struggle on a Tuesday afternoon? So by being curious, it will allow you to spot patterns. And it's not easy to spot patterns. It does take some time. But if you're curious and you kind of make some notes, it is easy to spot patterns. And then once you spot a pattern, it's usually not too difficult to identify the small number of reasons why there may be differences from day to day or from morning to afternoon, and then to begin to make some changes in that environment that might test whether or not your hunches are correct. So if it is always about sitting on the carpet and you as a teacher quite often have a cushion on your chair and you say, Johnny, would you like to sit on my cushion today? And then they have a brilliant story, they listen to the story and they engage and they give lots back into the lesson, then you can be pretty sure that it's the cushion that's made the difference. And so now you need to kind of make a mental note to find a cushion in the school for that child to sit on.
Absolutely. And we've got our ABC model that we can use as a way to sort of understand and track that behaviour. So it looks at the bit that's happened before the behaviour, what happened, what behaviour did we see, and then what happened after the behaviour. Could you explain for our listeners how an ABC model would work a little bit more?
I'd be delighted. I mean, who in the early years doesn't like their ABCs? So the ABC model stands for antecedent, behaviour and consequence. And it's a very simple model, and it helps us to realise that for any behavior that we're seeing, there's usually something that came before that we maybe didn't see, and that what comes before influences or encourages or allows the child to behave in a particular way, and engaging in that behavior normally has a consequence for the child, but usually also a consequence for other people, and that may be for the teacher or it may be for other children in the classroom. And so we do want early years practitioners to be really curious about those antecedents. So quite a lot of time, being curious about the antecedent will help you identify the pattern. So for instance, if the child's parents are split up, then the antecedents might be really dysregulated behavior on different days of the week or from one week to the next, which might prompt you to inquire of the parents, what is the pattern of childcaring? So this is a child who might be shuttling between two households, and that change in structure or different levels of structure between parents might be the antecedent to them having good days at school or bad days at school. Likewise, thinking about the antecedent might help the early years practitioner to be really curious about how behavior might vary before and after break, or before and after break on different days of the week. So being out in the playground for lots of SEND children is a real challenge. And quite often, the person on duty, so the lunchtime supervisor, plays a very important role. These are very important people in our education system. They're usually the poorest paid and the ones who receive the least training. Although I would personally be happily go on record to say they actually do the most difficult job, because they have to look after children in this really unstructured environment. And there's one or two lunchtime supervisors, two hosts of children. So quite often things happen in the playground that may be really triggering for SEND children. Other children say things happen, and it's impossible for the lunchtime supervisor to be able to monitor, regulate, and resolve everything that happens in the playground. So again, thinking it from an antecedent point of view, if the children are very dysregulated after break, there may be lots of things going on in the playground at playtime. If it's on certain days of the week, it may mean that some lunchtime supervisors are better than others, or maybe just simply that individual child has a better relationship with some lunchtime supervisors than others. So you will often maybe see a small number of SEN children are walking around with the lunchtime supervisor, and the lunchtime supervisor is having a nice chat with them. And all of that's really protective for anything that might happen in the playground, so that the child can return into the classroom after break ready to learn. So do be curious about, there's always an antecedent, just to be clear. But you need to look for what it is. You need to be curious about what the antecedent is. Then you need to think about the influence of that antecedent on the behaviour. And we really want to encourage early years practitioners to realise that we're talking about very young children with very low levels of emotion regulation, very low levels of self-awareness, very low levels of responsibility for their behavior, essentially. So not everything is premeditated. And so the behaviors are very much a response to those antecedents. So something happens in the playground, you can't regulate it, you go into classroom, you're totally unregulated, and the teacher just says something really simple like, hang up your coat, please, or something. And it's, bang, you just can't tolerate it. And so bearing in mind the antecedents and the behavior, we really encourage teachers to think carefully about the consequences. Now, every school has a behavior policy. They're required. What's really interesting to me as a professional is how much they vary, even in the early years. You think they're quite similar, but behavior policies vary hugely. So teachers are required to follow a behavior policy, but in the ABC model, I would really encourage teachers to think carefully about what the consequences should be, because quite often for SEND children, what they really need is validation. So rather than going straight to the behavior policy, you've been rude, don't talk to me like that, you're not following an instruction, and putting your name on the board, you're going to Amber, various early years providers have various different behavior management systems. Rather than going straight to that, which is really not what the child needs and actually can further trigger the child, quite often all that's needed is validation for the early years practitioner to say, I can see you're really struggling. I can see you're really upset. Do you want to tell me about it? Or how can I help you? Having that as an intermediary step quite often diffuses the situation, allows the child and the teacher, I must admit, to get back on track much quicker. And so in the ABC model, I would encourage early years practitioners to think very carefully about the A and the B, so that the C is usually much more about validation initially before you start following whatever it is, the behaviour policy that the school have set out.
I think that's a really fantastic place to end this episode on there. Really great moments to think about and put into practice as well. If anybody's there thinking they'd like to use the ABC model, have a quick Google, you'll be able to find out about it, but it's going to be really useful for you in able to start identifying what's happened before and how you can then support those children, and really focusing on that validation of how they're feeling. I think it's a really nice point to end on. Thank you ever so much for joining me today. That's been really, really great. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guest, David, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Ruth Lue-Quee, and Professor David Daley. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your settings and links to relevant resources.